I remember the exact moment I knew I had won. Not won in the way people imagine. No dramatic showdown, no speech, no moment where I pointed a finger and said, "See, I told you." That's not how it works. Not in real life, and not in any story worth telling. It was a Tuesday. I was walking out of a building I had just signed a lease for, my first commercial office space, 1,400 square feet in a city that had once felt completely closed to me, and my phone buzzed. Instagram notification. A follow request. Her name. I stood there on the sidewalk, people moving around me, the city doing its thing, and I just stared at the screen. 3 years. 3 years since she sat across from me at that kitchen table and told me, in the kindest voice she could manage, that she needed someone who was going somewhere, that she couldn't keep waiting for me to figure it out, that she was sorry, but she had to choose herself. And she walked out. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I didn't beg her to stay. I just became someone she never expected. I accepted the follow request, not out of spite, not to show off. I accepted it because by that point, standing outside my own office building with a team of 6 people working in it, with a 6-figure business I had built from literally nothing, I had no anger left. I had burned all of it as fuel. This is that story. This story isn't about revenge, it's about becoming. And I want to be careful with that word, becoming, because it sounds clean. It sounds like something that happens gradually and gracefully, like a sunrise. But I promise you, what I went through was nothing like a sunrise. It was more like learning to see in the dark, stumbling, falling, getting back up, over and over again. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if someone you loved chose to leave because they didn't believe in what you could be, if you've ever stood at the bottom of something and looked up and thought, "I don't even know where to start," then this story is for you. I'm going to take you through every part of it, the embarrassing parts, the parts where I almost quit, the parts where I genuinely didn't know if I was going to make it, and then the parts where everything changed. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because I put out stories like this every single week. Stories about transformation, about identity, about what's possible on the other side of your worst moment. Let's begin. I need to take you back to who I was at 26 years old, because without that picture, none of the rest of this makes sense. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. The rent was $640 a month, which sounds cheap until you realize that I was still behind on it most months. I was working a job at a logistics company, data entry basically, making $34,000 a
year. And I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that job. Honest work is honest work. But the problem wasn't the job. The problem was that I had stopped believing I deserved anything different. I had this idea, back when I was in my early 20s, that I was going to build something, an online business. I'd been obsessed with digital marketing, with content, with the idea that the internet had created this level playing field where somebody like me, no fancy degree, no connections, no family money, could build something real. I'd read every book, I'd taken free courses at 2 a.m., I had notebooks full of ideas. But at 26, those notebooks were in a box under my bed, unopened for almost 2 years. What happened to them? Honestly, fear. Repeated failure in small doses. I'd try something, it wouldn't work immediately, and I'd let that feel like proof that it was never going to work at all. I was confusing the process of building something with the verdict on whether I was capable. And slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice, I stopped trying. I started just existing. And that's when I met her. Her name was Danielle. She was 25, a project coordinator at a healthcare company. Organized, driven, had her 5-year plan written out in a Google Doc. Genuinely, I saw it once, and I was both impressed and terrified. She was the kind of person who returned emails within 20 minutes and knew what she wanted for dinner before noon. We were together for 2 years and 3 months. In the beginning, she believed in me, or at least she believed in the version of me I presented, the version who still talked about the business, the plans, the potential. I think she fell in love with that version, the one with fire in his eyes, who talked about what was coming. But what was coming never came. Month by month, the gap between who I said I was and who I actually was got wider. I'd come home from work exhausted, spend evenings watching TV, and tell myself I'd start again on the weekend. Weekends came and went. She started noticing, first with gentle questions. Hey, have you worked on that project lately? How's the website coming along? And I'd deflect, make excuses, promise next week. Then the questions got less gentle. Then they stopped altogether. And I knew something had shifted when she stopped asking, because it meant she had already gotten her answer. The night she left, the actual night, was a Thursday in October. I remember because the heat had just come on for that season and the radiator was making that clanking sound. She had made dinner, which felt significant in retrospect, like she'd wanted one last normal evening. We ate, we talked about nothing, and then she put down her fork and looked at me with this expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It wasn't anger, that would have been easier. It was grief. She said, and I'm going to quote her as exactly as I can remember, she said, "I love you, but I can't keep loving you in a way that doesn't go anywhere. I need someone who is going somewhere, and I don't think you believe that person is you." That last sentence, I don't think you believe that person is you. I didn't have a comeback, because she wasn't wrong.
I sat there at that kitchen table, and I watched her get up, walk to the bedroom, and start packing a bag she had apparently already prepared. She'd thought this through. She had grieved this already. She was past the hard part. I was just arriving at it. She left that night and moved in with her sister. She texted me 3 days later to arrange picking up the rest of her things. I helped her carry boxes to her car. We hugged once, briefly, at the door, and then she drove away, and I went back inside that apartment, sat down on the couch, and didn't move for a very long time. I'm not going to romanticize what came next. There was no immediate turning point. There was no lightning bolt. For about 6 weeks I was genuinely, thoroughly, completely lost. I ate badly, I slept too much and also not enough. I called my best friend Marcus more than I probably should have and talked in circles. I drove past her sister's apartment once, just once, and I'm not proud of it, but I'm telling you because I want you to understand I was not handling this well. The worst part wasn't even missing her specifically. The worst part was the silence where her belief in me used to be. Because as much as I didn't acknowledge it out loud, her hope for me had been secretly propping me up. Her occasional, "I know you're going to figure it out," had been letting me off the hook from actually figuring it out. When that was gone, all that was left was me, and I did not like what I saw. 6 weeks after she left, I got a call from my mother. Nothing dramatic, she just wanted to check in the way mothers do. And partway through the conversation, she asked how things were going with work, with the business stuff I'd talked about for years. And I told her the truth, for the first time maybe ever. I said, "Mum, I think I wasted the last 2 years of my life." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "Then stop and don't waste the next 2." 6 words. Stop and don't waste the next 2. I hung up the phone. I sat with that for about an hour, and something, I don't know what, I can't explain it scientifically, something cracked open. And that's when everything started to change. I want to be honest about what the decision actually looked like, because in movies and in motivational videos, the decision is always this cinematic moment. The hero stands up, stares at the horizon, and the music swells. That's not what happened. What happened was, the next morning, a Saturday, I woke up at 7 a.m., which was unusual because I'd been sleeping until 10 or 11, and I walked to my kitchen table, the same table where she'd told me she was leaving. I sat down with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I wrote at the top, "What do I actually want?" Not what I wanted to want, not what sounded impressive. What did I, the actual, specific, flawed 26-year-old sitting at this kitchen table, actually want? It took me almost 3 hours to answer that honestly. I wanted to build a business in digital marketing and content strategy. I'd known that for years, but I'd been hiding behind the word someday. I wanted to work for myself. I wanted to prove,
Not to Danielle, not to anyone else first, but to myself, that the person I'd been describing for 2 years was actually real. I wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page. I drew a box around it. Inside the box I wrote, "She was right, now prove her wrong." And then, and this is important, I crossed that last sentence out. Because I realized even in that moment that proving her wrong was the wrong fuel. It burns hot and it burns fast, and then you're left with nothing but ash. I'd seen people try to build things out of spite, and it never held. Spite is a sprinter's fuel. I needed something for a marathon. So I rewrote it. Inside the new box I wrote, "Build the life you keep describing. Build it now. Build it for you." That was the decision. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. Now here's where I have to tell you about the gap, because nobody talks about the gap honestly enough, and it's the gap that destroys most people's dreams before they ever get started. The gap is the period between decision and result, between planting and harvest. It's the months, sometimes years, where you are doing the work, but nobody can see it yet. Where you're changing, but you look the same from the outside. Where you can't yet point to anything tangible and say, "Look, it's working." That gap is where most people quit. I almost quit multiple times, and I'm going to tell you exactly what that looked like, so that if you're in your own gap right now, you know you're not alone, and you know it doesn't mean you're failing. The first month after the decision, I gave myself a specific, concrete assignment. I would build a freelance digital marketing portfolio and land my first paying client within 60 days. I had no portfolio, I had no case studies, I had a laptop, a basic understanding of social media marketing from years of self-study, and nothing else. I worked on it every morning from 5:30 to 7:30 before my day job, every single morning. I want you to understand that this was not easy because I am not a morning person. I was waking up in the dark in November in the Midwest to sit at a kitchen table alone and do work that no one was paying me for yet toward a goal that I had no evidence was reachable. The first 3 cold emails to small businesses got no reply. The 5th got a polite no. The 6th got a reply that seemed promising, led to a call, and then went completely silent. By day 45 of my 60-day window, I had 0 clients, and I was starting to hear a voice in my head that sounded disturbingly like every doubt I'd ever had about myself. On day 52, a restaurant owner in my city responded to an email I had nearly not sent because I figured it was pointless. She ran a mid-sized family restaurant with a terrible Instagram and basically no digital presence. I offered to run her social media for 1 month for free just to prove I could deliver results. She said yes. 30 days later, her Instagram had grown from 340 followers to 1,100. Her Friday dinner reservations had a wait list for the first time ever. She called me and said, "What do I owe you for next month?" I charged her $400. It was the first money I had ever made from something I built myself.
$400. I cannot describe to you what $400 felt like. Nothing has ever felt like it before or since. I held that check, an actual paper check. She was old school, and I just stood in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like myself. I want to pause here and talk about what I was doing on the inside during this period, because the external grind gets all the attention, but the internal work is where the real transformation happens. I started seeing a therapist about 6 weeks after Danielle left. This was not something I wanted to do. I came from a background, a working-class, Midwestern, men don't talk about their feelings background, where therapy was either for people who were seriously broken or people with too much money and time. I was neither, or so I thought. My therapist's name was Dr. Renee. She was in her 50s, completely unimpressed by my self-pity, and she had this way of asking questions that made me feel like the answer had been obvious the entire time, and I was just choosing not to see it. In our second session, she asked me, "What do you think Danielle's leaving means about you?" I said it meant I wasn't enough. She said, "That's a story you're telling yourself. What's the evidence?" And I realized I didn't have evidence. I had an interpretation. I had taken her leaving, which was about her needs and her limits, and turned it into a verdict on my worth as a human being. That's not logic, that's grief talking. And grief, left unexamined, becomes the story you live by. Over the following months, I worked hard on separating what had happened from what it meant. Danielle left because she needed something I wasn't providing at the time. That was real. But it didn't mean I was incapable. It didn't mean I was destined for mediocrity. It meant I was at a crossroads, and she, in her own way, had forced me to take it seriously. Eventually, and this took longer than I expected, I stopped being angry at her. Not in a performative, I forgive you way, just genuinely. The anger dissolved because I used it up. I poured it into 5:30 a.m. mornings, cold emails, steep learning curves, and small wins. By the time I didn't need the anger anymore, it was already gone. Let me give you the timeline, because I think timelines are important. People need to know this doesn't happen overnight. Months 1 to 3, first client, $400 a month, barely sleeping, making every mistake a new freelancer makes, undercharging, over-delivering out of anxiety, with no systems and no processes.
Months 4 to 6, 3 clients, $1,800 a month in freelance income. Still working the day job, building a basic website, getting my first testimonials in writing, reading 3 books on business development, 2 on marketing psychology, and 1 on pricing strategy. Month 7, a local digital marketing agency reached out. They'd seen some of my client work posted online. They wanted to know if I did white label services, essentially if I do work they could put their name on. I said yes. Revenue jumped to $3,400 that month between all sources. Month 9, I gave my 2 weeks' notice at the logistics company. My manager, a decent guy named Tom, looked genuinely concerned when I told him. He said, "Are you sure about this? The market's tough." And I understood that he meant well, but
Also knew that the market's tough is what people say when they've decided not to try. And I had already decided otherwise. My last day was a Friday. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was 40 degrees. I turned the music up loud. I screamed once, just to hear myself do it. And that's when everything started to change. Here is what nobody tells you about transformation. The visible changes come last. Before anyone could see what was happening to me, I had already lived through the invisible version, the version where I became someone different inside while looking almost exactly the same outside. Same apartment, same car, same general life circumstances, but something fundamental had rewired. Let me describe what that felt like. I used to walk into rooms with my shoulders slightly forward, not dramatically, not a hunch, just enough to take up less space, enough to signal subconsciously, I'm not sure I belong here. I'd been doing it so long I didn't even know I was doing it until my friend Marcus pointed it out about 8 months into my transformation. We were at a networking event, something I had made myself go to, even though I hated the idea of it. And afterward he said, "Man, you walked in there differently tonight, like you actually wanted to be there." And the thing was, I did. For the first time in years, I wanted to be in rooms where things were happening. I wanted to talk to people who were building things. I wasn't shrinking anymore. That was the invisible transformation becoming visible, and once it starts showing on the outside, it accelerates. By the end of year 1 of going full-time in my business, I had 11 clients, monthly recurring revenue $8,200. Not life-changing money by any global standard, but let me tell you what $8,200 a month meant after years of scraping by on $34,000 a year. It meant I paid my rent on time for 12 consecutive months. It meant I bought a new laptop, my first one in 4 years, without putting it on a credit card. It meant I hired my first contractor, a graphic designer named Priya, who worked 20 hours a week and was frankly 10 times more talented than I deserved at that price point. Having a team member changed something in me, because suddenly I was responsible for someone else's livelihood, even in a small way, and that responsibility did something nothing else had managed. It made the work feel bigger than me. When you're doing something for yourself alone, it's easy to quit on a bad day. When someone else is counting on you, when Priya was counting on me to bring in the work so she could pay her own bills, quitting became a much harder option. I don't recommend building a business only because you're afraid to let someone down, but I will tell you that accountability was a gift I didn't know I needed. The physical changes came during this period too, and I want to mention them not because they're the point, but because they're real, and ignoring them would be dishonest. About 4 months into the transformation, I started running, not because I had some fitness epiphany. I started because I was so anxious about the business, so wired with the kind of low-level stress that comes from being responsible for your own income for the first time, that I needed somewhere to put the energy.
3 miles the first week, 5 the second. By month 6, I was running 6 days a week, 5 miles a day. I lost 22 pounds without trying to lose weight. I started sleeping better. I started thinking more clearly. I started, and this sounds small, but it wasn't, I started looking in the mirror without looking away. That matters. It matters because how you feel in your own body shapes everything. How you carry yourself, how you speak, how you walk into rooms, and what you believe is possible for you. The body and the mind are not separate. I know that now in a way I couldn't have known it before. Year 2 of my business was where things shifted from "this is working" to "this is really working." I had built a system, not just a client list, a system, defined services, standard operating procedures, a CRM that kept me from dropping balls, a content strategy for my own brand that I'd been quietly building, a LinkedIn presence, a small newsletter, and eventually a website that actually explained clearly who I was and what I did. That newsletter, by the way, started with 11 subscribers. My mum, Marcus, a few clients, and some people who gave me their email at that networking event I'd forced myself to attend. 11 people. I sent it every week without fail for 9 months before it crossed 100 subscribers. I remember the day it hit 100 because I made myself a terrible cup of celebratory coffee and sat with it for a full 10 minutes, just feeling the smallness of the win and being genuinely proud of it anyway. Small wins, honored consistently, become big wins eventually. That's not motivational poster stuff, that's just what I lived. By month 18 of running my business, the agency that had hired me for white label work offered me a different kind of deal. They wanted to fold my services into a formal partnership. We negotiated for 6 weeks. I had a lawyer look at the contract, something the version of me from 2 years earlier would never have thought to do, would never have believed he could afford. We signed, and overnight my revenue model changed from month-to-month client work to a retainer-based partnership with guaranteed minimums. That was the moment I decided to look for office space. Not because I needed it exactly. I could have kept working from my apartment, but getting an office was a declaration. It was saying out loud to the world in the form of a lease, I am here, I am real, this is happening. It was 14 months from the night Danielle left to the day I signed that lease. 14 months. I want you to sit with that number, because I think people either overestimate how long transformation takes, thinking it requires decades, or they underestimate it, thinking it should happen in 30 days. 14 months of consistent, daily, sometimes painful, always humble work, that's the actual math. During this period, I need to tell you about the doubters, because there were some. Not enemies, I want to be clear about that. I didn't have people rooting for my failure, but I had people who expressed concern in ways that were really just skepticism wearing the clothes of worry. My uncle, at a family dinner about 6 months into my freelance journey, told me that the economy wasn't built for lone wolves anymore, and that I should think about stability. A co-worker. I'd stayed in touch with my uncle. A friendly guy, genuinely. Kept checking in with questions like, "How's the experiment going?" every time we talked, as if the whole thing were a cute hobby I'd eventually grow out of. And I want to tell you,
That stuff stings, even when you're making progress, even when you're confident in the direction you're heading. There is something about having your choices called into question by people you respect or people you used to want to impress that can knock the wind out of you. But here's what I learned about that. People's skepticism is almost always a projection. My uncle was skeptical because he had tried something once and it hadn't worked, and he'd decided that meant it couldn't work. The co-worker asking about the experiment was doing so because the idea of someone leaving a stable job terrified him, about his own situation. Their doubt was about them, not about me. I stopped trying to convince people. That was a huge shift. I used to feel this compulsive need to defend my choices, to explain the vision, to make people understand why this was going to work. And I realized I don't owe anyone an explanation. The results will be the explanation. Just do the work and let time do the rest. Internally, and this is the part that people rarely talk about in glow-up stories, I went through a long, strange process of figuring out who I was without the version of myself I'd performed for so long. The guy who talked about his dreams but never chased them, the guy who was smart-sounding but not self-disciplined, the guy who needed someone else to believe in him because he didn't know how to believe in himself yet. That guy was gone, and I had to actually figure out who had replaced him. I spent a lot of time alone that second year, not isolated. I had Marcus, I had my therapist, I had clients I genuinely liked. But I carved out intentional solitude in a way I never had before. Long runs, solo drives, Saturday mornings at a coffee shop with a journal and no phone. I was figuring out what I actually cared about, what kind of person I was becoming, what I believed in, not performance, actual content. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized I had stopped thinking about Danielle. Not in a dramatic, announced way, just she wasn't in my daily mental traffic anymore. I had been so preoccupied with building my life that the ache of her absence had slowly filled in with other things: purpose, progress, pride. That's the thing about becoming who you're supposed to be. It leaves very little room for grief over who you weren't. And that's when everything started to change. I need to set the scene for you carefully, because the encounter, when it happened, was not what I expected. And I think that's true for most people who live this story. The encounter is rarely a dramatic confrontation. It's usually quieter, and somehow, because of that, more complete. The Instagram follow request I mentioned at the beginning, that was actually the second contact. The first came about 2 months earlier. I had been invited to speak on a panel at a regional marketing conference, a mid-sized event, maybe 400 attendees, but for me at that stage it was significant. I was being introduced as a founder and partner of a growing digital marketing firm, which was still slightly surreal to hear out loud. The panel was on small business marketing strategy in a changing digital landscape. I was one of 4 panelists. I spoke for about 20 minutes in total, answered questions, and held my own with people who had been doing this longer than me. And afterward, at the reception part, the standing around with drinks part that I used to dread, I was approached by more people than I could keep up with. Business cards, LinkedIn connections, a few potential client conversations. I drove home that night feeling like a completely different person than the one who had started this journey. 2 weeks after the conference, a message arrived in my LinkedIn inbox.
I almost missed it because I get a lot of LinkedIn messages now, and I'm not always great about checking them promptly, but I happened to open it that evening. It was from someone I didn't recognize at first. The profile name was slightly different, a professional version, but the face in the photo was immediately, unmistakably recognizable. It was Danielle's best friend, a woman named Kira, who had been part of our social circle when we were together and whom I had always liked well enough. She was funny and direct, the kind of person who told you the truth without being cruel about it. The message was short. She said she'd seen my name in the conference program, apparently she'd been an attendee, and that she'd watched the panel. She said, "You were great up there. You clearly found your thing. I'm really glad for you." That was it. 7 sentences. I sat with that message for a long time, because what do you do with something like that? It wasn't an apology. She hadn't done anything requiring an apology. It wasn't a proxy message from Danielle, I don't think, though I considered that. It was, as far as I could tell, a genuine, uncomplicated expression of witness. Someone who had known me at my lowest point was now telling me she had seen me at a high point. I wrote back, "Thank you, Kira. That means a lot. Hope you're doing well." And I meant both of those sentences completely. The Instagram follow request came 6 weeks after that. I was standing outside my new office. I'd just finished signing the lease. I was flushed with the specific kind of joy that comes from a tangible milestone, an actual physical space with my name on the door, essentially. And then her name appeared on my phone. I can't tell you with complete honesty that I felt nothing. I felt something. It was complex. But what I can tell you is what it wasn't. It wasn't triumph in the way I might have imagined if you'd told me this would happen back when I was sitting on that couch the night she left. It wasn't a spike of, "Ha, told you so." It wasn't even sadness exactly. It was something closer to completion, like a story finding an ending. I thought about what I wanted to do for maybe 30 seconds, then accepted the follow request, put my phone in my pocket, and went back inside to introduce myself to the plants I had just bought for the office. That was it. That was the encounter. No showdown. No dramatic message exchange. No opportunity to deliver a speech I'd rehearsed in my head. Just a quiet digital acknowledgement that we both existed in the world and that I was doing okay. She never messaged directly. I don't know what she expected when she sent that request. Maybe nothing. Maybe she was just curious. Maybe Kira had told her something. I genuinely don't know. And this is the thing I want you to hear. I genuinely don't need to know. Because here's what I realized standing outside that building. This was never about her. That's the revelation that I think gets lost in revenge narratives. When someone leaves you, when someone tells you that you're not going anywhere, the pain makes it feel like they are the story, like they are the central figure, and you are just a character reacting to them. The whole experience gets organized around them. But they're not the story. They never were. The story is you, who you become, what you build, what you decide to believe about yourself when someone who loved you gave up on that belief. She left because I was going nowhere. That was true at the time. And instead of letting that truth break me, I let it redirect me. I let it light the fire, and then I fed that fire with everything I had. I want to tell you what my life looks like now, not as a brag, but because specifics matter in transformation stories. Vagueness is the enemy of inspiration. You need to see the actual picture. My business, which I officially named 22 months after the night Danielle left, is a digital marketing consultancy focused on small to medium businesses and non-profit organizations. We have 6 full-time team members and a roster of contractors we bring in for specific projects. Our average monthly revenue over the past quarter was $47,000. We've won 2 regional business awards in the past 18 months. I moved out of that $640 a month apartment 14 months ago. I live in a place that costs 3 times that now, and I am not underwater on it. I run 4 days a week. I sleep 8 hours a night. I see my therapist once a month now instead of every week. A sign, she told me, that I've built a solid enough internal structure to maintain things on my own. I have relationships, friends, mentors, and a new person I've been seeing for about 4 months that are built on who I actually am, not who I was pretending to be. And that last part is maybe the most important one, because the version of me who was with Danielle was performing, not maliciously, not intentionally even, but I was presenting a version of myself that I hoped might one day be real, rather than doing the actual work of making it real. And that kind of relationship, built on potential rather than actuality, is fragile in ways you don't feel until it breaks. Now the people in my life know me as I am, not as I might be someday, and that feels, I don't have a better word for it, it feels clean. About 3 months ago, I ran into someone who knew Danielle, not Kira, someone else from that old social world. We were at the same coffee shop, recognized each other, and did the obligatory catch-up. And he mentioned in passing that Danielle was engaged to someone she'd met the year after we broke up.
And I want you to know I smiled, genuinely, not performatively, because I was happy for her, not in a complicated, layered, teeth-gritted way. Actually happy. She had found what she needed. She had made the right call for herself. And because of that call, so had I. There is a version of this story where I spend the next decade hoping she ends up unhappy so that I can feel vindicated. I have watched people live that version. I have watched it hollow them out. I refused to live it. The goal was never for her to suffer. The goal was for me to become. And I did. So, here we are at the end, and I want to leave you with a few things, not a lecture, not a list, just the truths that I carry with me, that came directly from living this story. The first truth, other people's doubt is not your verdict. When Danielle told me she needed someone who was going somewhere, she wasn't declaring the final answer on who I could become. She was describing who I was in that moment. And she was right. But moments are not forever. Who you are today is not a permanent condition. It is a starting point. It is always, always a starting point. The second truth, the transformation you need is the one you do quietly. Not secretly, there's a difference. Quietly means you stop using other people's attention as fuel. Quietly means you stop announcing the journey and start actually walking it. The results, when they come, will speak for themselves. They always do. The third truth, do it for you. I cannot overstate this. If you are transforming your life for the satisfaction of watching someone who doubted you realize they were wrong, that is a legitimate starting point. I used it. But it cannot be the destination, because the day they realize it, the day you win that specific race, the fuel runs out. Then what? You have to have your own reasons to keep going. Build something you love for reasons that live inside you, not in someone else's reaction. The fourth truth,
The best revenge is a life well lived, but only if you're doing it for yourself. I think that phrase gets thrown around a lot without people fully understanding what it means. It doesn't mean live better so that they regret leaving. It means live better so that you have nothing to regret, so that when you look back, you see a person who chose growth over bitterness, who chose becoming over stagnation, who refused to let someone else's assessment of them be the last word. That's the real win. Not the moment they see your Instagram, not the conference panel, not the office lease. The real win is waking up every morning and recognizing yourself. If you are in the gap right now, if you are in the dark period between the decision and the result, I need you to hear this directly. Stay. Stay in it. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that it's not working. It is the process. It is exactly what it's supposed to feel like when you are becoming someone new. Keep going at 5:30 in the morning when it's cold and nobody is watching. Keep going when the cold email goes unanswered. Keep going when someone you respect raises an eyebrow at your choices. Keep going when the doubting voice in your own head sounds exactly like the person who left. Keep going, because on the other side of that gap is something you can barely imagine from where you're standing right now. I know, I've been on both sides of it, and I promise you, it's worth every single silent, grinding, unglamorous moment of the journey. That's the story. That's all of it. I'd love to hear yours. What's your glow-up story? What's the moment someone doubted you that turned out to be the turning point? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I mean it. If this video meant something to you, if any part of it hit, share it with someone who needs it. Hit subscribe if you're new here. There's a lot more where this came from. And until next time, keep building, keep becoming. The best version of you is not behind you, it's ahead.
I remember the exact moment I knew I had won. Not won in the way people imagine. No dramatic showdown, no speech, no moment where I pointed a finger and said, "See, I told you." That's not how it works. Not in real life, and not in any story worth telling. It was a Tuesday. I was walking out of a building I had just signed a lease for, my first commercial office space, 1,400 square feet in a city that had once felt completely closed to me, and my phone buzzed. Instagram notification. A follow request. Her name. I stood there on the sidewalk, people moving around me, the city doing its thing, and I just stared at the screen. 3 years. 3 years since she sat across from me at that kitchen table and told me, in the kindest voice she could manage, that she needed someone who was going somewhere, that she couldn't keep waiting for me to figure it out, that she was sorry, but she had to choose herself. And she walked out. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I didn't beg her to stay. I just became someone she never expected. I accepted the follow request, not out of spite, not to show off. I accepted it because by that point, standing outside my own office building with a team of 6 people working in it, with a 6-figure business I had built from literally nothing, I had no anger left. I had burned all of it as fuel. This is that story. This story isn't about revenge, it's about becoming.
And I want to be careful with that word, becoming, because it sounds clean. It sounds like something that happens gradually and gracefully, like a sunrise. But I promise you, what I went through was nothing like a sunrise. It was more like learning to see in the dark, stumbling, falling, getting back up, over and over again. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if someone you loved chose to leave because they didn't believe in what you could be, if you've ever stood at the bottom of something and looked up and thought, I don't even know where to start, then this story is for you. I'm going to take you through every part of it, the embarrassing parts, the parts where I almost quit, the parts where I genuinely didn't know if I was going to make it, and then the parts where everything changed. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because I put out stories like this every single week. Stories about transformation, about identity, about what's possible on the other side of your worst moment. Let's begin. I need to take you back to who I was at 26 years old, because without that picture, none of the rest of this makes sense. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. The rent was $640 a month, which sounds cheap until you realize that I was still behind on it most months. I was working a job at a logistics company, data entry basically, making $34,000 a
year. And I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that job. Honest work is honest work. But the problem wasn't the job. The problem was that I had stopped believing I deserved anything different. I had this idea, back when I was in my early 20s, that I was going to build something. An online business. I'd been obsessed with digital marketing, with content, with the idea that the internet had created this level playing field where somebody like me, no fancy degree, no connections, no family money, could build something real. I'd read every book, I'd taken free courses at 2 a.m., I had notebooks full of ideas. But at 26, those notebooks were in a box under my bed, unopened for almost 2 years. What happened to them? Honestly, fear. Repeated failure in small doses. I'd try something, it wouldn't work immediately, and I'd let that feel like proof that it was never going to work at all. I was confusing the process of building something with the verdict on whether I was capable. And slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice, I stopped trying. I started just existing. And that's when I met her. Her name was Danielle. She was 25, a project coordinator at a healthcare company. Organized, driven, had her 5-year plan written out in a Google Doc. Genuinely, I saw it once, and I was both impressed and terrified. She was the kind of person who returned emails within 20 minutes and knew what she wanted for dinner before noon. We were together for 2 years and 3 months. In the beginning, she believed in me, or at least she believed in the version of me I presented, the version who still talked about the business, the plans, the potential. I think she fell in love with that version, the one with fire in his eyes, who talked about what was coming. But what was coming never came. Month by month, the gap between who I said I was and who I actually was got wider. I'd come home from work exhausted, spend evenings watching TV and tell myself I'd start again on the weekend. Weekends came and went. She started noticing, first with gentle questions. Hey, have you worked on that project lately? How's the website coming along? And I'd deflect, make excuses, promise next week. Then the questions got less gentle. Then they stopped altogether. And I knew something had shifted when she stopped asking, because it meant she had already gotten her answer. The night she left, the actual night, was a Thursday in October. I remember because the heat had just come on for that season and the radiator was making that clanking sound. She had made dinner, which felt significant in retrospect, like she'd wanted one last normal evening. We ate, we talked about nothing, and then she put down her fork and looked at me with this expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It wasn't anger, that would have been easier. It was grief. She said, and I'm going to quote her as exactly as I can remember, she said, "I love you, but I can't keep loving you in a way that doesn't go anywhere. I need someone who is going somewhere, and I don't think you believe that person is you." That last sentence, "I don't think you believe that person is you." I didn't have a comeback, because she wasn't wrong.